presentation, how to access this presentation in Spanish and Armenian. Nuria?
Hola a todos, buenas noches. Yo voy a ser su intérprete esta noche de español. Espero que les guste. Y bueno, el doctor Knappik, como director de educación primaria, nos está haciendo las introducciones de nuestro superintendente, el doctor Matt Hill, nuestra superintendente adjunto de servicios educativos, Sharon Cuseo, y también nuestro superintendente adjunto de servicios administrativos, Debbie Kotka. Y bueno, el formato de y también nuestro coordinador del área tecnológica, el señor Robin Anders. Y bueno, el formato de esta presentación se va a grabar. De principio les queremos comentar esto. También si ustedes tienen alguna pregunta, principalmente en el idioma español, por favor háganoslo saber por el chat para que yo pueda hacer la traducción simultánea de dichas preguntas. Y bueno, para acceder al cuarto o a la sala en español, ustedes van a ver del lado inferior derecho un mundo color gris. Y ahí lo van a presionar y ahí va a decir español. Y bueno, pues ahí nos vemos. Yo ya no voy a poder tener contacto con ustedes. Entonces, lo que necesiten, por favor, háganlo a través del chat. Y bueno, espero que disfruten esta noche. Y muchas gracias. Ahorita les voy a introducir a our lovely translator of Armenian, Anna Arsamanian.
Thank you, Nuria. Բարի երեկո, այսօր մեր Lcap-ի տեղական վերահսկողության եւ հաշվետվողականության ծրագրի առաջին, այսպես ասած, հաղորդումն է, որը պետք է ներկայացնենք բյուջեն։ Մեզ հետ այս հաղորդումը վարում են տարական կրթության վարիչ դոկտոր Knappik-ը, մեզ հետ է նաև մեր գերատեսուչ դոկտոր Հիլը, մեզ են միացել նաև մեր գերատեսչի տեղակալները Տիկին Քուսեոն եւ Տիկին Քակտան, ինչպես նաև մեր տեխնոլոգիայի բաժանմունքից դոկտոր Անդերսը։ Ես Անա Արզումանյանն եմ, այսօր կթարգմանեմ ձեր համար, խնդրում եմ, եթե հարկավոր է ձեզ թարգմանություն, սեղմեք այդ գլոբուսի նշանը եւ ընտրեք հայոց լեզուն, կգտնվեք իմ սենյակում եւ ամեն ինչը կլսեք, իսկ եթե հարցեր ունեք, խնդրում եմ գրեք չաթի մեջ եւ կաշխատենք այսօր պատասխանել։ Բարի վայելում։ Back to you, Dr. Knappik.
Thank you, Anna and Nuria. We're going to take a minute or two to go ahead and have the translation channel be set up. And if you wish to select Armenian or Spanish, you do have that option to go to that interpretation globe down at the bottom of the page and then select it for Spanish and Armenian. And we'll be presenting in English tonight too. We also have our PowerPoint slides posted on the Burbank Unified School District website. And if you go under district info on the Burbank USD website, and if you select down towards the local control accountability plan button, then you can go ahead and open that up, and scrolling down for a little bit, you'll be able to see the presentations and PowerPoints in Armenian, Spanish, and in English. And then we'll be posting this webinar on that same website in that same area under today's date. I want to remind everyone that if you have questions along the way, you can post them in the chat, and that every 5 slides or so we'll be pausing and Dr. Anders will be reading out questions, and then we'll be responding to those questions here live. And once again, we're recording this presentation, so we're translating along the way. So we're purposely going to be going a little bit slow, and this allows for our translators to go ahead and translate. At this point, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Hill, who's going to do the first few slides, and then Mrs. Kutka is going to go ahead and take over after that. So Dr. Hill, it's all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Knappik, and welcome to everyone watching this evening and joining us or watching at a future broadcast. Tonight, we're going to give an overview of the Local Control Accountability Plan. The local control accountability plan is the strategic plan for the district. When you see the term LCFF, that's the local control funding formula. This is how we now receive funding from the state of California. Every student in California, we now receive a base amount of funding. And so that's the base funding, TK through grades 12. In addition to that, we have students that are classified as at-promise students. And that's when we talk about supplemental funding. And you'll see on the slide, supplemental funding includes English language learners, foster care, students who are homeless, and students who are socioeconomically disadvantaged students, or quite often referred to on our National School Lunch Program. I just want to take a moment to highlight the importance of all of our families to complete the National School Lunch Program with a meal application. This allows for your child to have services. It can be reduced fees for advanced placement fees, helps them for scholarships, it helps them for some of our summer programs, but it also helps the district receive funding so that we can do enhanced programs. And we will talk a lot tonight about supplemental funding. Ms. Kukta will be giving an overview on that. And you see how important it is to have those meal applications so we have the funding to support your child. And Nuria and Anna, let me know. You can tell me if I need to slow down too. I'm good. Okay, thank you. We do not receive concentration funding in the district. That's for districts that have unduplicated or at-promise students, those categories I just discussed, that exceed 55% of district enrollment. We do not qualify for that. Next slide, please. Every district in California develops that local control accountability plan, or LCAP, based on 8 state priorities. And you see them on the slides. And I won't go into detail because throughout the presentations this spring, we're going into more details about how we're meeting those 8 state priorities. But it goes everything from student access to parent involvement, et cetera. Finally, I just want to give an overview about the key goals for Burbank Unified School District. We've worked on a process last year. This is our 2nd year of our 3-year plan for our local control accountability plan. We worked with the Board of Education, received feedback through sessions like this to develop our 4 goals. These goals and this plan are going to stay in place for the 3 years. But since we're in year 2, we're going to give an update on the budget, our spending, and our priorities. And we welcome feedback so that we can revise the action items in the plan, but the goals will stay the same. And you see the 4 goals highlighted here. When we talk about supplemental funding, the key goals that we'll be talking about are goals 1 and 2. So those would be future sessions. The first one is around college and career ready via high quality instruction. Second is really around the physical, emotional, and mental health of our students. Goals 3 and 4 are important, but we don't have as many supplemental dollars that are tied to those goals. So 3 is recruit and retain quality employees. And then 4 is around efficient operations. Goals 3 and 4 primarily use base grant. Goals 1 and 2 use base grant as well as supplemental grant funding. I'm going to pause and see if there's any questions. Please put them in the chat. I'm happy to answer any questions before I hand it over to Ms. Kukta to start giving an overview of our budget. Okay, if we go to the next slide, we're handed over to our Assistant Superintendent of Business Administrative Services, Ms. Debbie Kukta.
Good evening, everybody. Really nice to have you all here today watching or looking at the recording in the future. So what we're going to look at is our first interim budget. So the district's fiscal year runs from July 1st to June 30th, and our first interim budget report shows the operating results through October 31st. So as we move to the next slide, we're going to take a look at the revenues that come into the district. And just as a high level look, if you focus on the LCFF resources, you can see that it by far is the largest component of the monies that the district receives. You may note a big increase between our adopted budget and our first interim results at first interim, and that is mainly due to the one-time COVID monies that we were recording since the budget adoption. The next slide shows some of the drivers to our revenues. So our revenues are based on, as we look at the next slide, Robin, the revenues show an indication with the cost of living adjustment, or COLA. So these figures are what we apply to previous years' receipts and build upon. You can see for 21-22, we used a cost of living increase of 5.07%. That increased for next year to 5.33%. And then it drops in 23-24 down to 3.61%. One of the things that I'd like to point out for 22-23 is that the Department of Finance, or DOF, has just come out with a revised COLA because California's receipts have been so much more than what they projected, that we're looking at a possible 6.17% COLA for next year, which would be really good news for the district. We are not going to, when we release our second interim results at the end of after the end of February, we likely will still reflect the 5.33 to be conservative. Looking at our LCFF base grant monies for this year, you can see the different amounts the district receives based on grade spans. So it costs more to educate our high school students. So you can see that the base grant amount is much higher for that 9 through 12 grade span age. Another driver for our revenue is our average daily attendance, or ADA. And you can see that the trend is continuing for declining enrollment. One of the hopeful things that we're looking at that was included in the governor's budget is that rather than using the prior year or current year's attendance at whatever the higher number is, that we may be able to use a 3-year average. So hopefully the numbers that drive our receipts will follow that path. We're waiting for the May revise, which comes out obviously mid-May, and then the final adopted budget that the governor releases in June. So the next slide, one thing we want to touch on, I mentioned earlier about the one-time COVID monies. So as of October 31st, which was the date of our first interim, you can see that our allocation was over $47 million. And you can see the various grant sources that came in. They each have different purposes depending on the grant, with the dates that they need to be spent by, which are the dates in the last column. And some of these monies were received in the previous year, the fiscal year that ended in 21, and some of them this year, and we'll continue to receive them. So the next slide takes a look at the impact of declining enrollment on our supplemental grant funding. Dr. Hill mentioned the importance of filing the free and reduced lunch applications. And it's been difficult for the district this year because we are providing free meals to everyone, which is a great thing to do, but it also, we do not need to have the applications on file in order to provide those meals. So that presents a little bit of a challenge for us as we look at, you can see down in the chart below the percentages of our unduplicated pupil count declining. The next slide takes a closer look at our enrollment. And again, you can see the general decline from year to year from 2019-20 through this year. The district, one of the things that we have done to sustain our revenue levels is to accept inter-district permits. One of the changes that we made this year that was initiated by our Budget Advisory Committee was to allow more people that work in the city of Burbank to enroll their students based on a permit, based on a much lower percentage of the time that they work in Burbank. But you can see that the numbers on the permits declined last year, but increased this year. And that has helped us sustain our ADA level, which our funding is based on.
Ms.
The
Keko,
next slide.
Ms. Keko, we had a question
Yes.
about the declining
Mhm.
meal applications, and if we think this is changing due to changing demographics or the effects that the count has in the decline.
That's a great question. It could be demographics, but we know for sure that it's a decline just because people haven't had the need to fill out the applications. We've done a proactive call out to try to generate those applications, but that's an interesting question. I don't know what the number would be that's attributed to the demographics. Another driver on these applications is it also determines the discount rate that we get for our E-rate funding, which is used for our technology infrastructure. So as our unduplicated count declines, so does the discount on our E-rate purchases, which currently sits at 60%. So that's another important driving factor in the importance on those. We do not have the options to decline the lunch. That's a federal guideline that's passed down to us. So we do need to offer that free for everybody. But the good news is the federal government has increased our allotment to cover those costs. So in this case, it wasn't an unfunded mandate. The decline in enrollment could be as well could be attributed to COVID. Anecdotally, we know that many families have moved to other locales. Some are teaching at home. Some perhaps have enrolled in private schools. So yes, some of the decline can be attributed to COVID. Those are good questions. Any more? Okay. Moving on to the next slide, talking about expenditures. Our largest percentage, you can see from the costs, are our salaries and benefits. So certificated represent our teacher salaries. The classified are the salaries, for example, for our office staff, our accounting staff, grounds, maintenance, facility staff. And you can see the large percentage of the benefits, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But at First Interim, roughly 83% of the district's expenditures are attributed to salaries and benefits. So that is by far the biggest percentage. And as you look at the expenditures too, you can see the impact of the one-time COVID monies coming in, and we budget as if all of that money goes out. So you can see where those portions of the pie chart at First Interim have also grown in comparison with the other parts of the pie. The next slide shows our USD expenditure drivers. So as we talked about on the earlier slide, in regards to benefits, you can see that our PERS and STRS rates have increased significantly. So PERS, for example, has the largest increase from 21-22 to next year, from 22.91 to 26.1%, all the way up to 27.1% in 23-24. And STRS had the increase for next year, but then is projected to stay level. So when you look at the important thing to note is when you look at what our cost of living adjustment was at 5.33%, and you look at our PERS contributions, which is a percentage of our classified salaries going up over 3%, that's challenging. PERS, and let's see, is PERS and STRS money you are paying people that have retired? Yes, that's the retirement benefits. As our employees retire, that money has been accrued. And one thing with these are defined benefit plans. So an employee may have only worked for so long and the investment rates covered those dollar amounts, but they get a defined benefit for the term of their retirement. So it's a benefit to our employees, but in the private sector, you don't see too many defined benefit plans anymore.
And Debbie, we should highlight that it's calculated as a percentage of our current salaries
Employees.
of our current employees, and it goes to a statewide fund to pay out for the retirees.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Hill. The second chart shows our contribution towards our special education, the restricted side of the general fund. And you can see that this is increasing year over year. This is one of those, I wouldn't say unfunded mandate, but an inadequately funded mandate where districts provide that education for our special ed students. Oftentimes the costs are higher. And so the costs are more than what our base grant monies come in. And so the district's general fund has to make up for that and cover the cost for our special education students. And then under our miscellaneous assumptions, all school districts participate in the same unemployment pool. So this rate, this 0.5 increased substantially from the previous year where it was 0.05%. And that carries forward through, it does reduce to 0.2% in 23-24. That's a percentage of all salaries. Health insurance increases are projected to increase by 2% every year. And our California Consumer Price Index, or CPI, you can see, and we are hearing a lot more about rising inflation right now. You can see, and these factors are provided by School Services, which is an agency that that many school districts across the state use for reference. You can see the rates that they are telling us that we should use in our projections for our multi-year. The next slide talks about some of the expenditure differences, and there's a lot of information on here on this slide, but what I'd like to highlight is our step and column increases. So those are increases that occur every year for both our certificated and our classified employees due to increased education units, perhaps, that our teachers have taken, or just over time, they will increase across in ranges. So those occur every year. Some of our teachers this year were paid from our one-time COVID funding so that we could maintain the smaller class sizes, which is better for our students, especially to address learning loss that happened during distance learning. We know some of our students didn't fare particularly well under that model. And then again, as we talked about under benefits, our STRS and PERS rate increases. The next slide shows the contributions from the unrestricted general fund to other funds, or other on the restricted side of the general fund. So we talked about our special education contributions year over year is increasing. Routine restricted maintenance is right now we contribute 3% to the restricted side, and that money must be used to maintain district facilities. That is offset by district rentals revenue. We have, the district has a couple parking lots that are rented out, as well as a house that is very near to boroughs that we get rental income from. And you can see what the total contributions are on that line, a pretty substantial part of the district's budget. The next slide, slide 15, shows our multi-year projection as of first interim. And this slide is, it's one of the requirements of school districts that you project out what your current year budget is going to be along with the next 2 years so that we can plan accordingly and look at what that looks like. You will notice, I want to highlight on this slide in 23-24, where our school board will have to adopt a fiscal solvency plan for expense reduction in order to keep our reserves at the required level of 3% of expenditures. So we have a little bit of work to do. The next slide shows some of the challenges that the district has. We have an ongoing structural deficit that we had seen a few years before COVID struck. And the district has strategically used, though, one-time COVID monies to ease the impact of the declining enrollment, for example, and other increases that we're seeing in our STRS and PERS benefits. But it's just delayed having the district have to address our structural deficit. We talked about on the earlier side about the fiscal stabilization plan to identify 6.25 million in cuts before 2023-24. And we've already made several $1 million of cuts over the last three or so years. So it's getting harder and harder to identify some of the cushion where we may be able to eliminate. And that does likely mean that we're going to have to look at staffing levels, since staffing levels are 83% of the costs that the budget, that the district has to cover. The last bullet point talks about those free and reduced lunch applications. Again, with the free meal service, there's no immediate need for families to complete those applications. So we're seeing a decline, not that the numbers have necessarily declined, but the applications that are being completed and filled in and filed with the district have declined. Our current staffing cap is negotiated with as far as class size, which obviously drives the number of teachers that we have. And that is on average across the district at 30.5%. So we are at that. We could, the budget committee, advisory committee has looked at that. We could staff closer to that 30.5%, or it's possible that we may need to look at increasing the class size in Burbank. When we compare Burbank class sizes to our neighboring districts, we are significantly lower than those, which is a great thing. It's great for our kids, but from a practical standpoint, we may need to look at that, but at least staff closer to that 30.5. And we know class size reduction, obviously, with the in our K-3 population that are at 24-1. So that's a different pot of money that comes in. So any questions any further questions before we go on to the next? Great, need to introduce a la carte items. You know, that is a question, Ms. Harville, that we hear a lot, reintroducing our a la carte items. I will say that our food services department is having challenges with sourcing, for one thing, but we're also having staffing shortages, which I think mirrors what we are seeing just across the economy. And they don't really have the staffing right now to do those a la carte items. That was a big revenue source for our food services department. So I can assure you that we are looking at those items, and we do get that question a lot. So hopefully we can introduce those back into the menu soon. So one of the questions is, would it make a difference to allow students to pay for a la carte items at the other sites with their accounts and not cash? That's a good question. I do believe they do pay with their accounts and not cash. We're a cashless operation. Now they use their codes to enter in. So I think I'm understanding that question right. Well, if to opt out, they just don't go through our cafeteria. So the meals have kind of stabilized. It's not as many as what we thought. Many of the kids do opt out of the daily meal service. But the food services department projects what those numbers are to limit the food waste, so we don't overproject and prepare too many meals.
Right. And we should highlight that, as you mentioned earlier, the federal government reimburses us for those meals, and it's a separate funding source. So right now, the cafeteria fund is fully solvent, so we have enough revenue to cover the cost of the meals.
So, excuse me, moving on to the LCAP supplemental funds. This is an update on the metrics and the budget that we look at. So we've talked a lot about that unduplicated pupil count, which is made up of the populations that Dr. Hill mentioned in one of the earlier slides. You can see the total enrollment, the free and reduced meal program, our foster, homeless, and English learner youth. And by eliminating any of the duplicates in there, you can see our unduplicated count. So this is what drives our supplemental funding. We don't qualify for concentration funding because we don't have a 55% margin. This calculates out to 35.4%. So we don't meet the threshold for concentration funding, but this drives the amount of supplemental funding that we receive. The next slide is taken out of our BOP, or our budget overview for parents. And again, it's just a high level view pie chart of where our monies come from. Again, mainly our LCFF, local control funding formula funds, is the main driver for the revenues that the district receives, which is an important reason why we're required to get input as to how those monies are spent on the supplemental side. So the next several slides take a look at the detailed expenditures under each of our goals that we saw on the earlier slide. I'm not going to go through all the details, but you can take a look at all of the identified areas, positions that we're spending, or programs, interpreters, childcare, state preschool partial funding.
I was just going to add, the reason we're not going into detail on each of these are in upcoming sessions, we're going to do a deep dive on these items, the metrics, the goals, and the dollars tied to them. But we wanted to make sure everyone had an overview tonight.
So, and the next slide just continues our goal 1 line items. The total of these amounts end up totaling $7,012,779. So goal 1 clearly has the bulk of the expenditures in this area. The next slide starts with our goal 2. And you can see some of the bigger pots, counselors, our community day school teachers, couple FTE stands for full-time equivalent. So that would be 2 full-time teachers at our community day school. The next page continues goal 2. So the goal 2 total is $3,585,108. And as Matt said, most of the focus on the expenditures here are goals 1 and 2. The next page looks at goal 3, and there's 2 items that are funded to address goal 3, our DEI coordinator and the planning for academy professional development. So that total here is $225,000. The next slide looks at our general fund expenditures identified in our LCAP. And you can see here's where GATE, I know that question is asked many times, is how are we funding GATE? You can see the first 2 items there address that. Again, music instrument repair and replacement, art supplies, world language, elementary music teachers, and this total here is $599,887. The planning for academy, Ms. Caseo, I don't know if you wanted to answer that because that's probably your baby.
I'm happy to do that as well.
Okay.
So last year during the development of the local control accountability plan, we set money aside to do planning for Luther Burbank to see if we could help bring back enrollment. They have seen enrollment drop at Luther Burbank. So we were going to explore the possibility of an academy. At this time, we haven't utilized those funds. The site hasn't agreed on how we would use the planning funds. So that will be revisited through this year's process.
Okay. So that's the end of our the LCAP, just the general high level summary. Here's some resources that are available at different locations. The school district website, there's a dashboard at our californiasschooldashboard.org, CDE, California Department of Education. And of course, Cal PTA is in there with some information. So with that, that completes the presentation. I think we'd be available if there's any further questions tonight. Dr. Knoppik, did you have any closing words?
Absolutely. So we want to thank Ms. Kutka and Dr. Hill for giving our overview this evening of our budget here in Burbank Unified School District, and then giving a big picture helicopter overview of our LCAP supplemental funds. As Dr. Hill mentioned, at 3 upcoming LCAP meetings, we're going to be doing a deep dive on the instructional services goal 1, and that'll be on February 23rd at 6 p.m. On March 9th at 6 p.m., we're going to feature the educational services goal 2. And then we're going to return to instructional services on March 30th at 6 p.m. and finish off the instructional services LCAP supplemental budgeted expenditures. Then going into May, we'll have a town hall. More than likely, the board will set that date, and then we'll adopt. We'll have a public hearing in June and then adopt the LCAP in June also at a board meeting too publicly. So I know there's a couple more questions that came in. I'll turn it back over to Dr. Anders.
Yeah, sorry. So there was a question from Ms. Harville about if there's any further outreach we can do to help alert folks about the revised hours parents work in Burbank to allow for eligibility in the district.
We do advertise. Our student services director, Stacy Cashman, and her team have put ads in, obviously not the Burbank paper because they already live in Burbank if they're reading the Leader probably, but they will put ads in adjacent neighborhoods, newspapers, Toluca Lake, North Hollywood, and so they do outreach.
But I put in the chat the link to the inter-district permit. That's the permit for individuals who work in Burbank. The applications open up for this upcoming year, March 1st. So we will be sending out more communication as we get closer to that. Once we do, I encourage everyone to forward that to your employer and your networks. And we're posted on our social media sites, but if you can all do that as well and really highlight the fact that we understand, especially in Burbank, there's a lot of people that work 10, 20 hours in Burbank and they did not realize that they could send their children to our schools. I want to just thank the Budget Advisory Committee again for that idea, because we have a lot of people that did not know and they couldn't prior. So once it opens up, I put the link there. You'll see communications from the district, but please push that out to your networks as well. And then let's see, is there a reason why DEI PD is part of goal 2 and DEI consultant goal 3? When we were focused on the instructional goals and social emotional goals, that's just how we prioritized it. The DEI consultant was working with our work with BTA, Burbank Teachers Association. So when we were planning on that, we wanted to make sure it aligned with our HR strategies, but the goals cross over both. So it's not limited, it's just for the plan, we have to pick one goal to identify the funding.
And as we're pausing here, waiting for additional questions, I want to remind everyone that we do post the recording onto the Burbank Unified School District website. And if you go to district info. And if you scroll down to the local control accountability plan button, then that'll open up that tab. And then you'll be able to go on to that page and see not only this presentation and the PowerPoints, but the other ones that will be posted for the upcoming meetings. We do post ahead of time the PowerPoints, and we post all the recordings. And then you'll see on that same web page the current LCAP plan. You'll see past plans on there, and then also we have also our past meeting recordings too and PowerPoints. I don't see any further questions at this point in time. Any final thoughts, Dr. Hill?
Just want to thank everyone for participating, and this is an ongoing process. So if you're watching this after the date, please send us feedback. Please attend future sessions. We want to have this ongoing dialogue. But thank you all for taking the time this evening to join us, or if you're watching in the future, thank you for taking the time. Have a good evening.